I'm always very self-conscious when the Fitzgerald being the regional phenomenon that it is. What makes me qualified to present on the topic? I think Bruce, my co-author on the Legend Lives On book. Bruce is the executive director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. He and I figured when we sat down to do this, we asked ourselves, why should we add? What did we have to bring to the table that was fresh to a subject where we calculated something getting on to 20 or 25 books have been already been published on the subject. What could we bring that was different? And I would like to hope that the answer to that lies a little bit in my own background. I am a lifelong student, I guess you could say, of Great Lakes maritime history. I am a photographer by training. I worked in the commercial business of photography for a number of years and have been very lucky to escape that fate, and I've spent the last 15 years or so able to pursue my avocation, sort of a life's work, documenting Great Lakes shipwrecks and beginning underwater. My interest in the subject sort of broadened to a point where Great Lakes ships that were still actively trading on the inland seas became also a subject of fascination. The work I'm probably best known for at this stage is a book called Centennial, which was a sort of what you call a coffee table book about the St. Mary's Challenger, which at the time I was working on the project was the oldest steamship still actively in service, certainly on the Great Lakes and probably anywhere in the world. She's built in Detroit in 1906 and sailed 107 years on the lakes before she was finally converted to a barge. So I sailed with the crew with my cameras for a period of 4 years leading up to the centennial anniversary of the vessel's launch in 2006. She was, as I am fond of saying, the most extraordinary of ordinary ships. 107 years on the Great Lakes. Those of us who are familiar with Great Lakes shipping know that cold, fresh water preserves hulls both underwater and above the water in ways that you just don't see anywhere else in the world. My day job, such as it is, my very lucky privilege I am the staff photographer at Discovery World Museum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm coming to you today from the sunny shores of Lake Michigan. I began my career here almost 30 years ago as the volunteer photographer when I was learning the trade back in the day when you had to be close to labs, photo labs, if anybody remembers those Pleistocene days before digital. So I worked downtown, and I would come down on my lunch breaks and other free moments to photograph the construction of what is now the only example of a traditionally rigged three-masted Great Lakes schooner. The Dennis Sullivan, which is our state flagship, and the Sullivan sails from our dock here at Discovery World Museum. So in 2015, in commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the sinking of the Fitzgerald, Bruce and I published this book, which was the fulfillment, for me at least, of pretty much a lifelong ambition. And here's the proof. My author photo, if you have the book, is this picture taken in 1980. That's me, camera right there with the bad haircut. I was 9 years old when this picture was taken. That's the number 2 lifeboat from the Fitzgerald. That at that time was displayed on the deck of the Valley Camp, the museum ship there in the Sioux. And I recall staring at that lifeboat, which is mangled very badly, and the number 1 boat is ripped virtually in half. And I recall thinking as a 9-year-old kid, what kind of weather, what kind of physical forces must have been rampaging around that night to not only sink the 729-foot ship that these boats were attached to, but to rip these big steel lifeboats up. Looked like a dinosaur had taken a bite out of the thing. And that morning, I used my allowance money to buy this book, which is probably the best-known book, the first book published, I believe, in 1976 by Fred Stonehouse, who's a well-known historian from Marquette, Michigan, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And as you can see from the condition of the book, I read that thing about 10,000 times. In my younger years, I've always been a big reader, and I suppose at this stage, some idea formed in my head that I would like to someday write a book or books about Great Lakes maritime history. Flash forward 10 years or so, and I had graduated high school, and I didn't have a very successful college career. I was sort of lost, young person. I didn't quite know where I was headed in life. However, I found my way back to Great Lakes maritime history in my early 20s, and enough what was then a stunt of sorts to impress a waitress I was working with. I got certified as a scuba diver. I thought that would make me very dangerous and interesting to her. And so from about the early, I got certified in 1993. From that point forward, I never looked back. My what had been a hobby or sort of an interest became sort of a full-time, almost a full-time obsession. I worked full-time at a dive shop for a period of years. And we ran dive excursions, dive trips all around the Great Lakes. And I was able to, within a year, pretty much pursue my hobby full time, which was an exciting thing to do for me. It was difficult in those years. This was before digital photography, and I hacked around a little bit with underwater photography in the film era, and that was unsuccessful, I thought, in terms of creating something, sort of a visual aid, that when I was asked to give a lecture about what we did underwater here in the freshwater seas, I took up in an effort to have something to talk about, or to create a visual to talk about. I took up painting, which I was mediocre at best. However, it opened some doors, and I was able to meet some people in that period of my creative life. In fact, if you look on the left there in that newspaper clipping, in that middle photo on the left, that's me with Dennis Hale, who I met early on in my coming and going on the Great Lakes, and he became sort of a lifelong friend and a big. He encouraged my interest over the years. I was always real appreciative of that. So at some point, a year or two on, I just felt like I did not have the chops to be a maritime artist, but because I was broke and I couldn't afford to pay anyone else to photograph my paintings, I took up photography, which was providential. And that brings us to the subject of today's talk, and probably the only reason we're talking about Kathy. I think I saw you're here today. The only reason we're sitting here talking about the Edmund Fitzgerald today is because of this man. That's Gordon Lightfoot, as most of you may know. He wrote the song, which became a #2 hit here in the U.S. Lightfoot is basically the Canadian Elvis, and in the 70s, especially 70s and 80s, he was wildly popular, and quite an unusual thing to have a fairly melancholy song about a Great Lakes shipwreck rise to almost the top of the Billboard charts. So that song has sort of survived. What is it now, 40 plus years, 45 years on, you still hear that song everywhere at this time of year. So I had gone, this is another project of mine called Faces of the Lakes. I photograph people who are connected to Great Lakes maritime life, and I had set up this very complicated portrait of Gordon Lightfoot, and he was very gracious. At the time, he had different management. It's much harder to get to now, but at that time, I worked with his manager, and we were going to take him out to the ore dock where the Fitzgerald loaded its last cargo, and he was going to have his sunburst guitar, and we were going to take this portrait. Well, the whole thing fell apart. The tour bus was late. The sound check didn't work right. And he called and said, look, I just can't do this portrait. However, if you'd like to come to the concert, he was playing in Duluth. This was in 2000. So we got not only to see the concert, but then he invited us backstage, which was a real hoot. And I took this little snapshot as sort of a consolation prize. And in some ways, it is a fine memory of a very unique evening. Anyhow, so that's why we're talking about the Fitzgerald. This is the lighthouse, a light station at Whitefish Point, Lake Superior. The Fitzgerald sank about 15 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. This is also the location of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, which I have been proud to serve as a board member of the Shipwreck Museum since about 2007. And at the Shipwreck Museum, we have the bell that was recovered from the Fitzgerald wreck in 1995. That's Tom Farnquist with the bell there. He was an early mentor of mine, a great supporter of my work, and was gracious enough to let me photograph the bell. He make this portrait of Tom with the bell. Two interesting anecdotes about Tom that I recall. One, Tom was a diver from the earliest days in the 60s when the very first divers were exploring the Great Lakes. And I recall him telling a story of, if anyone is familiar with the wreck of the Cedarville, fairly large freighter, one of the big post-war shipwrecks. It sank in 1965. Tom was diving the Cedarville when there were still bubbles coming out of it. That anecdote always stuck in my head. And when the Fitzgerald sank in 1975, Tom was already recognized as the local expert. And so when the Coast Guard sent up the first helicopter with the magnetometer in it to try to find the wreckage of the Fitzgerald, they took Tom along because he was familiar with all the other wreck targets in Whitefish Bay or outside of Whitefish Bay, and the Coast Guard didn't want to be confused by locating what was an already known steel hull underwater. Tom founded, with some other folks, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society and eventually the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. This is some of the work we do. We're still actively engaged in finding Great Lakes shipwrecks, some of the hardware that we employ underwater. And there's another project I'm super proud to be involved with, sort of a multidisciplinary, multimedia, full archaeological and maritime art for a frustrated, washed-up maritime artist working with. This is Ken Marshall, who was the illustrator who is probably best known for his work illustrating or painting the wreck of the Titanic when it was located in 1985. Ken created a series of 5 underwater site paintings of 5 well-known and very historically significant Great Lakes shipwrecks in Whitefish Bay and around Whitefish Point. It's a fascinating project to be involved in, and this is one of my favorite wrecks in Whitefish, or just off of Whitefish Point, the John B. Cowell. And Ken was able to render the site in a way that, of course, a camera or video or an ROV or any other kind of technology, you just could never see the site from this perspective. Here's something I was able to lend a hand in Photoshop, blending the underwater site with the topside view, which was created by Bob McGreevy, who's a well-known maritime artist up in Harbor Beach, down in Harbor Beach, I guess, Michigan. And of course, the Fitzgerald, which is the bread and butter, I guess you could say, of the Shipwreck Museum and the Shipwreck Society. And it's probably the second most famous shipwreck in the world, thanks to the song. In my younger years, I was chasing people and things and ships around the Great Lakes, I would often crash with people, friends around the region. I was too broke to afford hotel rooms for the most part. And if it was too cold for me to sleep in my car, I would usually rely on the kindness of strangers. And I got to know Tom Farnquist in the late 90s, unfortunately just a little too late to go along on the last expedition to the shipwreck in 1995. And he took pity on me, and initially I would stay on the floor. I would just throw my sleeping bag on the floor of the old office, the Shipwreck Society office in Sault Ste. Marie there. And one night I was bored, and I started digging around, and the Shipwreck Society has become something of a collection point for Fitzgerald ephemera. People who are connected or interested in the wreck, when they find something and they think it should be something that is more in the public domain, they often send it to the Shipwreck Society. So I started sort of as a great enthusiast and a fan, I guess you could say, of the mythology surrounding the wreck of the Fitzgerald since I was a very little kid. I was sort of spine-tingling to find this, for instance. This is the thing that really put the hook in me. This is Captain Ernest McSorley's original, what's called a Z-card, a Coast Guard certification, kind of an official document. This is his original Z-card photograph from 1932. McSorley was a 44-year veteran lake sailor when he went down with the Fitzgerald. And this is a kind of a haunting view of him as a younger man. This is the more mature McSorley receiving his 25-year clock from Columbia Steamship exec. He had been with the company very obviously a long time, and the Fitzgerald was sort of the fleet flagship, so it was a rather plum assignment to be the captain of the Fitzgerald. So what Bruce and I set out to do with the book was to create sort of a multimedia visual representation of the story, a little different than some of the other accounts, which focused mostly on the mystery of the sinking. Bruce and I felt that the ship had quite an interesting history before that it became the second most famous shipwreck in the world, and we'd like to talk about that. And then you can't, of course, talk about the Fitzgerald without talking about the shipwreck. So, of course, we did that as well. But we wanted to start at the beginning, basically, and tell the whole story. So these are images that are in the book, and this was truly a collective effort. Bruce and I and dozens of historians and curators and private individuals who contributed their images or paintings or stories. It was really a collaborative effort. These two images, left and right, laying the slide transparencies, laying kind of the first keel plates of the Fitzgerald at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in 1958. Fitz was a Seaway-sized bulk carrier and the largest ship, the Queen of the Lakes, when she was launched in, I suppose the keeling was in 57. She was launched in 58 and was the Queen of the Lakes for a couple of years before the Ryerson, I think, or the Homer came out that year after. The image on the right is a painting, actually. The Fitzgerald family was from my hometown here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Most of the family had been involved in the maritime industry. Mr. Fitzgerald was not, actually. He was the CEO of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, which is still headquartered here in Milwaukee. They were also patrons of a Milwaukee artist, Edmund Fitzgerald, who was a well-known, what they called a precisionist painter. So they hired him to create some original paintings during the construction of Fitzgerald. You can see one on the right there of them creating or lifting a modular section of the web framing for the mid-body, the cargo hold, basically, of the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1957. This is a great, later in the construction, this is in the floating dry dock at the Great Lakes Engineering Works. You can see the ship sort of surrounded by workmen, and see them even on the top of the funnel there. The vessel is unpainted at this point, or at least much of it is sort of in its earliest red lead sort of incarnations. I thought that was a pretty interesting stern view of the ship. Here's a color shot from launch day. It's a huge crowd in its time in 50s and 60s. A ship launch, side launch, which is kind of unique to the Great Lakes region, was a big public event. The number escapes me off the top. It's something like 9,000 people, 10,000 maybe, were present for the launch of the Fitzgerald. And it was quite a spectacle. I've only seen one side launch myself of a vessel much smaller than the Fitzgerald. It must have been quite a thing to see. Here's a nice panoramic shot of the ship kind of being snubbed there, and of course creates a huge wave, as you can see, that washed up and unfortunately washed into some of the viewing stands. And as the legend goes, one of the spectators actually died of a heart attack. The bleachers, the viewing stand, being sort of engulfed by this launch wave, panicked into the point that he had a heart attack and died. And of course that's considered bad luck if you're an old school mariner. I believe Mrs. Fitzgerald was also unsuccessful in cracking the bottle the first time. This is the actual champagne bottle, or what's left of it, that was used to christen the ship. I believe it took her 2 whacks at the bottle, which is considered bad luck in the old school. This is Edmund and Mrs. Fitzgerald on the spar deck of the Fitz. The Fitz, although home ported and owned here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was only in Milwaukee one time. She was engaged in the iron ore trade. We don't have any steel mills here in Milwaukee, but during the steel strike of 1959, the boat came into port. It was laid up here in Milwaukee because they had no work for it, and being a virtually brand new ship in 1959, the Northwestern Mutual Company arranged for very successful public tours. People were able to come and take a walking tour of the entire vessel. So this was the only time that Mr. Fitzgerald was ever on the vessel. Interesting anecdote from my own experience. The gentleman who founded the museum that I work at was a business leader in Milwaukee from way back, and knew Edmund Fitzgerald personally. Mr. Fitzgerald, according to his recounting, was uneasy with the proposition of having a vessel named for him because he was not, unlike his uncles, he was not actually a lake sailor. So the story I was told is that during a board meeting, he stepped out to use the restroom, and at that point they voted to name the ship after him, which he begrudgingly accepted upon his return to the conference table. And evidently, after the ship was lost, he was never quite the same. They kept a flame burning, a candle burning at their home, as long as he was alive. Mr. Fitzgerald was alive after the wreck in 1975, and he was never quite the same. This, again, Fitzgerald was the largest ship on the Great Lakes when it was built. It was the fleet flagship, sort of a corporate yacht for the Columbia Steamship Company, and it was quite a thing to be the captain of the Edmund Fitzgerald. This is her, I believe it was her second captain, Captain Peter Pulser, who made quite a name for himself and for the vessel at the Sioux Locks in particular. He was famous for playing classical music and sort of narrating. He used the ship's loudspeaker, which was sort of a new thing at the time. He would play hockey games over the PA and narrate the ship's passage through the Sioux Locks, much to the delight of anyone at the viewing stand. He was known as, he insisted on being called the Commodore of the Columbia Steamship Line. So he became sort of a local favorite, and as a consequence, the Fitzgerald, because she was big, and because her captain was sort of eccentric, she became sort of a boat watcher's favorite from the get-go. There's another deck shot of the captain's Fitzgerald's third captain, Newman Larson. He's coming down the deck, probably going to lunch with someone from the Shipmaster's Lodge, if I had to guess there, based on his blazer. This was taken in the mid-1960s. Here's a view of the galley crew, some of the As Fleet flagship, the Fitzgerald carried passengers, guests, not really passengers because they don't pay to go on the trip, but they're guests of the company. And Fitz was fitted out with 4 staterooms for VIP guests of the company. You see 3 of them here with the galley crew. The man in the chef's hat in the middle is Red Bergner, who became somewhat infamous after the wreck for testifying about the unseaworthiness of the Fitz. He had bleeding ulcers and had left the boat a couple of days or a week before she sank, so he dodged that bullet. The gentleman on the left, whose name I am trying to dredge up, actually, he was the porter from Superior, Wisconsin. His name may occur to me. He actually had the misfortune of going down with the vessel when the ship sank. Here's some guests enjoying a high old time in the rock cut, if I had to guess. They're downbound in the St. Mary's River, or upbound, downbound, I guess that would be. As you can see, there's probably some drink involved here. It must have been a very pleasant thing in those years, before everyone had air conditioning and before anyone could just go jetting off to Jamaica or whatever. If you went on a cruise, if you were from Chicago or Cleveland, you'd get out of the heat of the city, go up to Lake Superior, take a tour of the North Shore, and be catered to hand and foot. Wonderful meals, all the booze you can drink. It was a pretty pleasant couple of days up and down. This is the ship's guest lounge, taken in the mid-60s. I don't expect the television worked very well most of the time. You can see on the extreme left there the painting of the brig Columbia, which was the first vessel engaged in the iron ore trade for the Columbia Steamship Line. That would be quite a thing to see underwater, I'm pretty sure. Here's the Fitz downbound in the Detroit River, passing Zug Island, which is where her last cargo was destined in 1975. The only thing Lightfoot got wrong in the song, maybe because he couldn't rhyme anything with Zug Island, but the ship was not actually going to Cleveland. It was going to the National Steelworks at Zug Island in Detroit. These are 2 of the youngest members of the crew. These were other photos that really haunted me as I dug into the collection of the Shipwreck Society. This is Bruce Hudson and Mark, bad with names. I cannot think of the fellow's last name, but both in their early 20s. It was not unusual in those years for young people like this, to put themselves through college by working during the summer months on a lake vessel. Bruce Hudson was the name. Bruce Hudson and Mark, I feel awful. I can't remember. Anyway, they were both working their way through college and were lost when the ship sank. Here's probably the most famous, well-known photo of the ship, taken by Bob Campbell, a well-known Great Lakes photographer, downbound in the St. Mary's River. And I believe he and Roger Lever, the king of the boat nerds, publisher of Later Ships, I think they were in the boat together, if I'm not mistaken, this day. And Roger then took this shot as she passed, going down river. Here's a really interesting, this is one of my favorite photos, a little unusual in terms of it being a photo of Fitzgerald. But Bob Campbell tells the story. A woman named Dorothy Lang, who was a Sioux resident and the secretary for the area engineer at the locks, was an amateur photographer in the 60s. And she took this photo, took many wonderful photos that were sort of lost to history. Took this photo of the Fitzgerald locking downbound in the MacArthur lock as they're digging the new pole lock. So this would have been about 68, 68, somewhere in there. And this interesting photo all by itself, but the really interesting story is many of her photos were stolen. Her car, she had them for whatever reason. I don't recall why, but she had, in those days, of course, they had mounted 35 millimeter slides, and she kept them in her car, had them in her car. And the car was stolen, and the thief just chucked out the slides. I don't know if he ever stole anything else out of the car or just went for a joyride. I don't recall the exact circumstances. So Dorothy assumed that the slides were gone forever. And however, being a local person, someone from MDOT, from the Department of Transportation, was weed whacking in the bush on a local highway in the springtime. The spring, winter came and went, and in the spring, the road crew was cleaning up the shoulder of the road, and here the crook had pitched out the box. It was a metal box the slides were in. And this gentleman working for the road crew happened to know Dorothy and returned her slides to her, which were in turn given to Bob Campbell some years later. So this photo, were it not for a very lucky combination of circumstances and some good Samaritans, would have been lost to history, and quite a thing to survive a whole winter in a, out in the elements in the deepest UP. Quite a thing that this photo survives. This is the Fitz's normal trade route taken out of a folder that the company used to give the guests, so they kind of knew where they were headed. Head of lakes there, 2 hours, Duluth, Silver Bay, depending, and then down to what was known as the Toledo Express, because she hauled ore down to Toledo, Ohio, predominantly. Because, again, she was the fleet flagship. Guests came and went. Here's a young lady at the helm wearing the captain's hat in the early 60s. This is one of those haunting photographs. That's Jack McCarthy, who was the first mate. Presumably that's his family. Crewmen were allowed to take their families on trips occasionally. That's probably his wife and daughter, if I had to guess. Fairly close, probably 73, 74, so quite close to the shipwreck. These are the last 2 known photos. Maybe there are others, but as far as we know, these are the last 2 known photos taken of the ship in October of 1975 at National Steel at Zug Island. Detroit, taken by Paul Lamar, who's a well-known maritime artist and tugboat captain, and happened to be passing by on one of the Gaelic tugs on this particular sunny October day, and took the last 2 frames of the Fitz going about her routine business before she sailed off into legend. So the Fitz loaded, as most people know, at Superior, Wisconsin in November 9th, 1975, and headed across Lake Superior into what became a giant meteorological bomb, 3 giant weather systems that collided sort of unexpectedly over Lake Superior, and became sort of the storm of the decade. And the Fitzgerald, probably due to a very unfortunate combination of circumstances, plunged to the bottom of Lake Superior around 7:10 p.m. November the 10th, 1975. This is an artist's rendition of her last moments. This is an interesting photo found kind of coincidentally taken by a wheelsman for the Bethlehem Steel fleet. This is the Sparrow's Point, which was a ship about the same size as the Fitzgerald. This is actually on Lake Michigan in the 1990s, but it gives you some sense of what's called a boarding sea. This is a very large ship, and that is a very large wave hitting a very large ship, to the point that green water, as you can see, is sort of cascading over the cargo deck or the spar deck. And that water creates a lot of stress on the hull and a lot of weight, of course. And these are similar to the conditions the Fitzgerald was experiencing, probably worse than this. Lake Superior is bigger than Lake Michigan and is capable of producing bigger waves than Lake Michigan. This is probably a 20-foot sea. Fitzgerald was being clobbered by 30-foot seas, and then they would have these, by certain captains recounting these rogue seas that were 35 and 40 foot, which is an enormous freshwater area. It's very dense. It's like a sledgehammer hitting the vessel from the stern over and over again. Another artist's rendition of Captain McSorley making the famous "We Are Holding Our Own" radio telephone call to the Arthur M. Anderson, which was a big lake ship following the Fitzgerald through the storm. One of the great mysteries is why the captain didn't make an SOS call if he knew they were in mortal danger. And, of course, the last words from the ship were quite sort of nondescript. "We are holding our own," and that was it, which is a kind of a haunting epitaph. There's many things about the Fitzgerald story that are as good or better than any fiction you could sit down and write, which I'm sure is why it's become such an enduring story. This is a great anecdote from similar photo to the one I was telling you about, of Gordon Lightfoot. This is Captain Dudley Paquette, who in 1975 was captain of the Wilfred Sykes, which is another well-known lake ship. They loaded opposite the Fitzgerald on November 9th, 1975, and then Captain Paquette, who was an excellent avocational meteorologist, had been following the National Weather Service isobar charts and was convinced a huge storm was brewing, and no one else apparently was aware of that or cared. Before the Fitzgerald sank, I would wager many captains, lake captains, were sort of what they call heavy weather sailors, and perhaps were convinced that the Great Lakes just couldn't produce conditions severe enough to sink a vessel as big as the Fitzgerald. So the captain of the Fitz, the captain of the Anderson, set off business as usual. Captain Paquette took the Sykes up the north shore of Lake Superior, a much longer route, convinced that this huge system was going to hit, which of course it did. And the Sykes went to anchor in Thunder Bay, and calamity came to the Fitz, and the Anderson survived, having absorbed the beating of a lifetime. And this photo was made in 1998 in Duluth, and I had sat down and asked the captain if I could make his portrait for the series, and he was very uncomfortable, I recall that, with being photographed. And so he wouldn't even look at me directly, and that whole thing was very awkward, and it's not one of my favorite pictures. But after we were done with that, we had breakfast, and he told me, "You keep an eye peeled, young man. You're going to see a weather system like you haven't seen since the wreck of Fitzgerald." And sure enough, I went on the job that Tuesday. This was taken on a Sunday morning. On a Tuesday, there was a storm that was the worst storm, the lowest barometric reading over the Great Lakes since the Fitzgerald storm of 1975. He called it again. All those years later, he called it once again. So that meeting has always stuck with me. Just a view to give you some sense of the violence of that weather. A semi-trailer truck tipped over on the Mackinac Bridge, tipped over by the winds that day. Some headline news of the day. The William Clay Ford, shown in this painting by Doris Sampson of Duluth, went back out into the weather to search for survivors after the Fitz was reported missing. Kind of a very heroic act. The Anderson turned around, and the William Clay Ford went out of safe anchorage in Whitefish Bay to search for survivors of the wreck. This is Captain Don Erickson on the William Clay Ford. A year later, he became quite well known for his connection to the Fitzgerald sinking. Here's a really unique period view of Henry Steinbrenner going over the wreck site about a week later after the Fitz sank, going over the wreck site off Whitefish Point. You can see the crew turned out there in their finest 1970s garb, throwing flowers into the lake over the wreck site. Father Richard Ingalls, who became famous in the song for ringing the bell 29 times for each man in the Fitzgerald. I had a strange, dubious, I guess, fortune or misfortune of photographing him on the right there, that color photograph. In 2006, he presided over his annual blessing of the fleet in the Mariners Church at Detroit, which is also made famous in the song. And sadly, not long, a week or so after I took this photograph, he had a stroke and passed away. So this photograph was taken during the last blessing of the fleet that he presided over at Mariners Church. Captain Bertie Cooper here on the right, the Arthur M. Anderson, as she appeared in 1975. The Anderson followed the Fitzgerald through the storm that night, and is the most of what we know about what happened that evening are based on testimony given by Captain Cooper and other officers of the Arthur M. Anderson. Here's the scene at Sioux Control as the Coast Guard tries to absorb sort of the shock of one of the greatest, well-known, largest ships on the Great Lakes having gone missing, which is something that just didn't happen very often. And it's difficult to accept for a lot of people. There's a piece of wreckage that came in that was recovered. Not much, considering the size of the vessel, was ever found. The two lifeboats a life raft, an inflatable life raft, some life rings and broken furniture, and that was it, just sort of flotsam and jetsam. On the left there is the Newsweek article, as the story goes, that Gordon Lightfoot read on an airliner about the wreck of Fitzgerald, and that inspired the song, which supposedly was written in one night or sort of a one-off, and the recorded version was performed in one take. And and if you're a Gordon Lightfoot fan, you know the man is, like I said before, basically the Canadian Elvis, and he considers, of all his wonderful catalog over probably half a century, he considers the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald to be his finest song or his favorite song in the event. Here's the first video pictures beamed back to the Coast Guard vessel that was sent out to investigate. Once they located the hull, the wreckage of the hull, with a magnetometer, they sent what was then state of the art, but by today's standards, quite crude ROV down with a video camera, and they were able to identify the wreck by these pictures. You can see the ship's name inverted. The stern section of the wreck, this wreck, as you'll see in the next in the painting here, this was done by the official Coast Guard illustrator from the 1976 expedition. You can see the stern is inverted. The middle section of the wreck collapsed and exploded when the vessel hit the bottom, going full speed ahead. And then the stern, which was still under power, presumably sort of, the thinking goes, inverted the action of the propeller turning, inverted it, and then it landed on the bottom upside down. Here's another view of the inverted stern. You can see the web framing of the bottom, actually, that has collapsed down onto the lake bed, and the cargo, the spar deck, actually ripped. The violence, I guess, is what I'm driving at here. The violence of the sinking was tremendous. That's probably inch-thick steel that is bent and withered like paper. The inertia of that giant hull, fully loaded with 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, hitting the lake bottom, going full speed ahead as it submarined, as it was sort of overwhelmed finally by that huge following sea, as she was losing buoyancy, presumably because she holed herself, or there was the two theories, I believe, based on having talked to a number of people who were there that night, that either she touched bottom or the hull worked to the point, was stressed to the point that it failed, cracked, and the vessel was flooding catastrophically. We know from the testimony of the officers of the Anderson that the vessel was listing very badly, and that just shouldn't be. So the vessel was sinking, and the thinking of lake captains that I've talked to that were on the lake that night was that Captain McSorley knew that their only hope was to beach the ship in shallow water in Whitefish Bay, and he didn't want to panic his crew, so he just put the throttle full ahead, and they ran for their life, basically, and lost the race, unfortunately, about 15 miles from safety. Oops, double slide. Jacques Cousteau was the second individual to go to the wreck site in 1980. That was quite a thing. They didn't learn very much. The wreck is so devastated that it's very difficult to make any concrete assumptions about what did or did not happen that night. There's just not enough left, and the stern is upside down, and the bow is buried in the mud to its summer draft lines. It's very hard to tell what might or might not have happened based on the wreckage. This was a very powerful moment when the Shipwreck Society raised the ship's bell in 1995. On the left there is Buck Champeau, who was the third engineer on the Fitz the night it sank. On the right is his brother. The story he was telling as he was laying hands on the bell was that his brother had told him, Buck had told his younger brother when he went to Vietnam in the 60s, that if anything happens to you, I will come for you. I will find you and come and get you. He was sort of reciting this as he was touching the bell, saying, I've come for you now, and you can rest in peace. I'm here. We have the bell as a sort of memorial to you, and I'm here. Here's an interesting moment during that 95 expedition. Ransom Cundy, who you see in the inset there, was a watchman, or wheelsman, I forget, the wheelsman, I believe, and his daughter asked if we might place a beer in the pilot house. He was a fan of his suds. So the pilot of that newt suit, which you see there, that 1 atmosphere submarine, basically, that a guy wears, put the beer in the pilot house in honor of Ransom Cundy. This, to me, was one of those haunting pictures. This is the radio direction binding antenna, which is folded back by the hydrostatic pressure as the vessel plunged into the bottom of Lake Superior. That's a fairly substantial instrument. If you go on the Valley Camera, there's an example of one. You'll see that it's heavy gauge pipe. It's quite a substantial piece of equipment, and the hydrostatic pressure folded it right back like paper as the ship plunged. Here's the memorial bell that was placed on the site after we brought the ship's bell up. There's Lightfoot, Gordon Lightfoot, with Tom Farnquist and some family members once the bell was placed in the gallery of the shipwreck museum. Gordon Lightfoot often comes for the ceremonial bell ringing every year on the 10th of November. That's held at the shipwreck museum. Here's a sonar image of the vessel that was made in 2005. I'm not an expert at reading sonar returns, but it would seem to me that based on this, the vessel has sort of deteriorated a good deal. And I'm not sure this is actually the case, but it appears to some, based on the shadows here, that the spar deck of the bow has actually collapsed in the interim between 1995 and 2005. It's hard to say. I would have to rely on someone with more expertise than me to make that call. Here's a shot of the famous open door on the pilot house. The port side door is open, undogged, and in that sort of weather, the night the Fitz sank, it would be unusual for someone to have undogged that door unless they were running for their lives, which is quite possible that as the ship submarined into the back of one of those huge following seas, that someone opened those dogs and tried to dash out of that door. And that, of course, lost as the vessel plunged. Here's another shot of that inverted stern showing her home port, Milwaukee. This is an eerie photo. All that violence as the boat crashed into the bottom. These light bulbs, rather, are totally intact on the ship's. This is the ship's masthead, forward masthead, and the navigation lights and the what's called a whistle light, that's C, which stood for the Columbia Steamship Line. All of those light bulbs are still intact. It's sort of creepy. Here's a shot of the bell breaking the surface on the 4th of July, 1994. In 1998, the site, there was a lot of controversy regarding visiting the Fitzgerald in those years, which is, of course, a gravesite for the 29 men that were lost. So in 1998, the Mariners Church consecrated the site aboard that bagpiper is aboard the classic Mackinac, the old Mackinac icebreaker, the Coast Guard icebreaker. And Mariners Church hosted a consecration ceremony over the wreck site. It is hoped that the site going forward is respected now as a grave site. Here's ringing the bell, which will happen next week, virtually, sadly enough, because of our fabulous pandemic. Normally this is an in-person event at the Shipwreck Museum. Once a year, the names of the 29 men who went down with the ship are read off, and the bell is tolled once for each crewman, and then once again for every mariner lost on the Great Lakes, which is estimated at something like 30,000 people have perished in storms and catastrophe and accidents while working out on the inland seas. This is also in the book. I mentioned the Anderson. One thing I wanted to do, because it was a great excuse to do so, was to take a ride on the Anderson, the Arthur Anderson, which went through the storm. Fitz is still trading 40 years later, still very hundreds of millions of tons of cargo move on the Great Lakes very safely. There's usually no mayhem and disaster. It's a very safe system. And as a consequence, the Anderson is still trading 40 years later. So I, by the good graces of some contacts in the U.S. Steel, the Great Lakes Fleet, as it's called now, they were able to arrange a trip on the Anderson 40 years later in January of 2015. The boat was still sailing in the late season. The season stays open now until they close the lock on the 15th of January normally. So this was the vessel's last trip. It became the last trip of 2015, so the 40th anniversary of the sinking of the Fitz. So I got on the boat in Two Harbors, Minnesota, loading taconite ore, which is the same cargo that Fitzgerald would have carried downbound to Zug Island. This is taconite ore, in case you're wondering. It's pelletized iron ore. Looks a bit like rabbit pellets. And that is what the Fitz and the Anderson were carrying that night and also 40 years later. Here's a view from the pilot house crossing Lake Superior and some fairly heavy ice off the Keweenaw Peninsula. And passing Zug Island in the Detroit River. This is where the Fitz would have been heading that night, that day, that couple of days, fateful days in 1975. Another kind of poignant part of the story. This is 2005, which would have been the 30th anniversary of the sinking. That's Father Ingalls and Mac McAdam and Don Erickson, who was captain. William Clay Ford and Richard Orgel, who was the third mate of the Fitzgerald, obviously not on the boat. He was on vacation on a different boat in 75. They sailed down on the Westcott, which is the mail boat there at Detroit, Michigan. And some taconite pellets had come up in the skids of the submersibles that were used in the 95 expedition. And the Shipwreck Society gave those pellets to this group, and this group then aboard the Westcott delivered those pellets ceremonially to the National Steelworks, the Great Lakes Works, as it was called then, and sort of ceremonially completed the voyage, the 30th anniversary of the sinking. This was the culmination of 40 years of my dream. This is the day the book showed up on the truck after 40 years of dreaming about it. And then the real dream, we got Gordon Lightfoot came up to the point that November for the bell ringing ceremony. We gave him a copy of the book, which was quite an honor. Some interesting stuff. This is kind of my last couple slides here. Has come out of the woodwork. One of the fun things about these projects is they tend to energize people all over the place to kind of come forward with things, interesting things that they have. This is a great shot that came out of the woodwork just this past summer. This is a great shot, kind of in red lead as the vessel was being constructed in Detroit. They're towing her into the graving dock, the floating dry dock. That shot early on, the black and white shot where I was talking about the funnel. This is what it would have looked like in color being towed into the graving dock for what they call wet side work on the propeller and other systems that are under the water. So this is a really excellent color shot of the vessel, almost completed but not yet painted in 1958. Here's another, just a beautiful, this was taken by Hal Jackson, who's a photographer in the Detroit area. Just a really beautiful sort of summer scene, sunset scene on the Detroit or St. Clair River. And then one thing we wanted to do with the book was to have photographs incorporated in the layout of all 29 men that were on board the ship that night when she sank. And we had 27 of 29 when the book went to print. And since then, we now have all 29 men. This is Joseph Mazes, who was a maintenance man on the boat when she sank. We did not have this photo when we did the book. If we ever do a second edition, he'll be in it. And then this is the second mate, James Pratt, who also, prior to the publication of the book, we did not have a photo of him. This isn't a great photo, but it's a photo nevertheless. And for me, for something that has become so mythologized and sort of like almost a distant memory, is so legendary that it's not even real. It's always very grounding to see the faces with the names, and always haunting. And that's it. That's that's my spiel, such as it is. So it's 12 o'clock, and I suppose I could throw it open to any questions. This is one of those. This is more than any other subject. There can be, hundreds, literally hundreds of questions because it's such a mysterious event. And to be honest with you, I don't have any great insightful answers about what happened. But if I can be of help, or if I can answer any of your questions before I have to dash off and do another talk at 12:30 today, which is very unusual, but I'm happy to do so.
Thank you, Chris. Let me get this slide loaded here. And thank you for that. I don't know, we've been having a lot of audio problems. We're not sure if it's background noise there at Discovery World or some mysterious glitch in our system. So we apologize to everybody for the noise that was in the background. We were frantically scrambling to try to resolve the situation, and our apologies. Hopefully the recorded version will be a little clearer. We'll find out probably later today or tomorrow. Meanwhile, while everybody has an opportunity to enter questions into the chat for Chris, I'm going to just update our status at our visitor centers in Duluth and Sault Ste. Marie. We have stopped our outdoor guest services. As you can imagine, our weather conditions are no longer conducive to that. But at the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center, they are still doing vessel arrival and departure announcements. There is a cell phone tour that is available. There's also a virtual tour of the visitor center online. And the gift shop has now moved its operations online as well. At the Sioux Locks Visitor Center, we also have stopped our guest services. And we have our park open now for the winter hours, which is 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. It's still a great place to watch Great Lakes shipping. And we will reopen in the Sioux on Mother's Day if health conditions permit, and Duluth will resume its winter hours whenever health conditions permit. And with that, let's see if we have any questions come in for Chris. I had a question for Chris that I set aside. Are you able to hear me? Okay, my audio has gone out, but if you can hear me, then we will just go for it. My question was, aside from the Edmund Fitzgerald, do you have a favorite shipwreck?
I would say the story of Daniel J. Morrell, which occurred in Lake Huron in 1966, is probably my favorite, only because I became friendly with the sole survivor. 29 men crew, one man survived this sort of horrendous odyssey in his underwear and a pea coat out on Lake Huron in December. It's just, again, like the Fitzgerald, you could not write a fictional tale that would be more compelling in terms of shipwreck and survival in this case. So it has the one element that the Fitzgerald doesn't have, which is to say a survivor who lived to tell the tale. And then the idea, the Fitzgerald, the wreck is devastated on the bottom of the lake, but the Morrell was actually torn in half by the storm, and the stern kept going. It was still under power, and it sailed something like 5 or 6 miles before it sank. And the idea of that, the image of that in one's mind is just spine tingling. So I think I would rate that one as my favorite.
That's one of my favorites too. Another question we had here, in your opinion, what is the best reference book on the Fitzgerald?
Well, there's, I think Stonehouse's book is, it was written close to events, but he got a lot of it right. I like that one. I think Robert Hemming's book, the title escapes me right now. It's an interesting read. It's hypothetical. I think it's called Gales in November. He basically writes the book from the viewpoint of the men who were on the ship. So sort of hypothetically imagines what would have been going on the vessel that night. And it's
kind of a shipwreck historical fiction.
Yeah, right. It's like you are there. And then there's been a new book of late by Michael Schumacher, who's well known. He's written books about the Bradley and Morrell wrecks. And it's mostly testimony that has not been in the public purview for whatever reason from the inquest after the Fitzgerald sank, from the Coast Guard inquest. So there's some really good information in there that you may not see in any other book. It's dry, a lot of it's rather dry, and as far as I could tell, there were no great insights like, aha, here's the smoking gun. No, I don't think that smoking gun will ever be found, and that's part of what keeps the story alive, I'm convinced, is the fact that it is always a mystery, it will always be a mystery, and that's part of what I find, and I think a lot of people find fascinating about it.
Stuart has submitted a question, and he is asking, out of thousands of shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, why do you think that the Fitzgerald is so captivating?
And as I said early on in the talk, I think it's the song. The song is really good. It's not cheesy. It's not clumsy. It's very accurate. He wrote that very close to events. And other than the bit about Cleveland, it's pretty much right on the money. Anything he narrates or presupposes in the song could have happened. The hatch caving in, for instance, it's possible that a hatch cover failed. And that is my theory. That's why it's become a pop cultural phenomenon, bigger than the Great Lakes, because of the song.
And then someone was saying that when they are out and about, they plan to go and look for your book. Any ideas where they might look for it?
Well, the best place, it was kind of created for the Shipwreck Society as a fundraiser of sorts for the museum. So really the only place you can get it is at the museum, or in this case, because the museum is closed for the season, on the museum's website, which is GreatLakesShipwreckMuseum.com. And you can purchase it there on the online in the online gift shop.
And we have a question from Richard. What changes have been made to present another disaster like this?
Well, I would say an abundance of caution, which is to say masters generally and companies were humbled by the loss of the Fitzgerald, and I think there is less appetite for driving boats, lake carriers into bad weather. So I think people go to anchor more than they might have in the 70s. Survival suits became required equipment. If you wind up in the water in Lake Superior in November, in the old days, you probably didn't stand a very good chance of surviving because of the 40-degree water. After the Fitzgerald sank, I doubt anyone got off the Fitzgerald, but if they had, they would have died of exposure very quickly. After the Fitzgerald, on every vessel, for every member of the crew, you have this Gumby suit, they call it. It's a very heavy neoprene, sort of looks like a wetsuit, and you can get in that, assuming there's time, and go overboard and have a much longer survival time in cold water than you would have pre-Fitzgerald. Weather forecasting, I don't know that any of that was driven by the Fitzgerald disaster, but the weather forecasting now with satellite technology in particular is much better. So people have a much better view of what's coming than they would have in the old isobar map days of the 1970s. I believe vessels are now required to carry a fathometer, which they weren't in those days. So if the Fitzgerald wandered into shallow water around Caribou Shoal, which is one of the theories, now possibly, although in those conditions it's hard to say, but the crew might have had some sense that they were in very sketchy terrain. They were in very shallow water. That would be another improvement in navigation.
We had a little piece of information shared by Thomas Holden, the former director of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center, and he is pointing out that copies of the transcripts from the U.S. Coast Guard hearing are available online from Bowling Green State University. And he reports that they are quite interesting for their content and the many, many things they didn't ask and people not interviewed. There are at least 3 reels of microfilm documents available as PDF files. So there's a source lots of people might have an opportunity to dig into.
Sure, and that's, sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was saying that's one of the enduring mysteries that keep the story alive too, was there a cover-up of some sorts? There's a lot of, something like that happens. There's a lot of how to say it without cursing, keister covering by various interested parties. So yes, there are gaps in the testimony, and certainly you could, especially in an age of conspiracy theories, you could say that there were some interesting things that were left out of the official record.
And then we had another question from Melissa. Do you think there will ever be any opportunities for someone to figure out what happened the night the Fitz went down?
No, I would say that again. I don't know that I would bet my next 3 paychecks on it, but considering first of all, the wreck site is closed, and I don't expect it to ever be open to exploration anytime soon. And by the time, perhaps 100 years from now or 50 years from now, if that ever happens, the thing will have deteriorated even further. The bow is buried in the muck and taconite. It's own cargo, and it's very difficult to see. You can't see the bottom. There's no way you could ever see the bottom of the ship, so you can't say, well, here's the grounding damage. The center section of the vessel is exploded and ripped to shreds, so you'd never be able to tell it touched bottom that way. The stern is upside down, so you can't see any topside damage on that end of the stick. And again, the violence of the sinking was so tremendous that, in my opinion, and it's only my opinion, it will always be impossible to tell exactly what happened.
Okay, we had a question from Kathy I could answer quite quickly. She's asking if the recording of your presentation will be available for purchase, and I am happy to be able to tell you it'll be available for free on the Detroit District YouTube page. I will post a link to that at the end of our session here. And Tom Holden is asking, do you have a favored theory or group of theories as to what sank the Fitzgerald?
Well, based on my conversations with Captain Paquette, who was the only person to come out, he wrote a well-known book, which is also an excellent read. If you're looking for recommendations, it's called The Night the Fitz Went Down. In his opinion, the vessel had been overloaded. The draft lines had been relaxed by the Coast Guard, officially overloaded, mind you, over the period of years. And the hull had been stressed. McSorley was a well-known heavy weather sailor. Another great book written by one of her naval architects at the Great Lakes Engineering Works, Ray Ramsey. He postulates that vessel design had sort of outstripped, or vessel capacity and size had outstripped their ability to sort of extrapolate in the pre-computer days. So the Fitz and many of her ilk were perhaps too big, bigger than the construction methods of the day and new technology like welding, perhaps. So she was a little tender, as they say, as the old timers say, to begin with, and then she was driven hard and put away wet for her 17 years and officially overloaded relative to her design capacity. And so she was ripe, as they say, and there are known, some folks have workers at the Fraser shipyard in Superior, where she had been serviced in the off-season, loose keel plates, bad welds. So she was tender, right? So she goes into this storm of the decade, and something happened to the hull. I don't think it was cargo holds. Don Erickson was very clear about that. The Ford boats, and he was a heavy weather sailor, and that sort of green water on the deck, which was somewhere between 7 and 12 feet at various times, wasn't enough to put, in his words, enough water for a cup of coffee in the cargo holds. And the Fitz, having this terrible list and having these very high capacity ballast pumps, there's no reason that vessel should have been listing like she was unless there was a catastrophic problem with the hull. So either she cracked, there was stress fracture in the hull that started, the ship started to take on vast amounts of water, or she wandered into shallow water, that reef that wasn't very well charted around Caribbean Island. They were running blind, both radars out, the Whitefish Point beacon was out, and she may have gone aground or touched bottom in those very big seas in the shallow water, and she would have opened her hull up there too. And was shipping water and submarining slowly. And as my Captain Paquette and a couple of other lake captains that I'm friendly with feel, that Captain McSorley knew perfectly well that they were in serious trouble, terrible trouble, but you don't just go on the radio and start screaming, especially if there's no real help anyone can render, and you don't want to panic the crew and have someone try to leave the ship, because that would be a death sentence also. So he just tried to ride it out and drive her into Whitefish Bay and either beach her in shallow water there or get down to the Sioux before they were overwhelmed, and they just lost the race. So that would be basically they lost buoyancy due to some sort of compromised hull problem. The hull was compromised. They were losing buoyancy, and those very large breaking seas, including possibly the Three Sisters theory, that Anderson was hit by 3 sort of rogue waves in quick succession. That may have been enough to put her under once and for all. And she dove into the bottom, and that inertia of that destroyed the ship to the point that it's impossible to really ever tell exactly what happened.
Okay, well, thank you. That seems to be the end of our questions. And I will just point out to the people watching still that Tom Holden has posted a link to that collection of the Coast Guard hearing transcripts for anyone that wants to jump in the chat and cut and paste that to do some of your own research. And I want to share in all of the participants who have been typing in, thank you. Thank you very much for this really cool, interesting presentation.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the background noise. I don't think that was me, because I'm the only one here.
Okay, we're hearing like microwaves and slamming.
Oh, really? Okay, well, that is microwave.
It's a little crazy, and we can't find anyone to mute. But we appreciate you driving on and doing your best in some challenging circumstances. And thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this program.
Very well. Thanks.
So for those of you still here, I hope you can come back in the future. The next program on November 19th will be Hawk Ridge, Counting for Conservation. And they will be talking about the North Shore and its importance for migratory birds and the research work that they are doing there. And in December, on the 3rd, Park Ranger Steve will be doing a program, Sun and Stars to GPS, and they'll be talking about the evolution of navigation technology and tools on the Great Lakes. And on 17 December, Dr. Frank Bowles, the author of Sailing into History, will be doing an exploration of Great Lakes shipping in the 20th century. Again, we hope you'll join us again. Meanwhile, up here you see some of the different ways you can keep touch with us and keep track of what's happening in the Virtual Visitor Center and at our visitor centers. I'm going to post a couple links here. If you give me just a minute, we'd really appreciate, especially if you're new to the Virtual Visitor Center, filling out our survey. I've just posted a link to it in the chat feature there. And if you can let us know how you found us, where you're coming from, that helps us improve these programs. Also, suggestions of future topics that you might like us to tackle in the Virtual Visitor Center. And I will also post that link I promised to our YouTube channel. We have quite a collection of maritime and nature programs available there. They are all free. And I've posted a link to that there in the chat. If you have any questions for myself or the park rangers in Duluth, we'll be here on the platform for a few more minutes, and we welcome you to submit those. And again, I hope you'll go to that survey. Thank you very much.